Willie Glenn woke to silence. Not the kind that meant peace, but the kind that came before something broke. The valley below her cabin was filled with shapes that shouldn't be there. Hundreds of them, men on horses standing motionless. In formation, their bodies dark against the pale dirt. She pressed her palm to the window glass, cold and fogged from her breath. They weren't moving, just watching her house. She had fed 15 starving men the night before. Now there were hundreds. The arithmetic didn't make sense. Neither did the fact that they hadn't attacked yet, or that every instinct screaming at her to run was met with an equal pull to stay exactly where she was. 3 days earlier, Willa had buried her last chicken, not from hunger or sickness, but from spite. A fox had torn through the coop and left nothing but feathers and silence. She'd stood over the small grave, her hands still dirty from the digging, and thought about how much the world seemed determined to take from her. The ranch her husband built with his bare hands felt heavier every morning. The wood creaked louder. The wells seemed deeper. Even the mountains looked like they were leaning in closer, pressing down on her shoulders. Nolan Cassidy had stopped by that afternoon, his face already set in, that expression he wore when he wanted to say something she wouldn't like. He sat on the porch rail, had in his hands, turning it in slow circles. "You should come stay at my place for a while, just until things settle." Things had never settled. Not since the treaties failed. Not since the skirmishes started creeping closer to the valley. Not since her husband's heart gave out 3 winters ago. Willa looked at Nolan and saw the same thing she saw in everyone else's eyes lately. Pity mixed with impatience. They were all waiting for her to admit she couldn't handle this alone. "I'm fine here." He shook his head, stood up, and walked to his horse. Without another word, she watched him ride away, dust rising behind him in a thin line that hung in the air long after he disappeared. That evening, as the light fell flat and orange across the valley, she heard them, voices low and careful, speaking a language she didn't understand. She stepped onto the porch, her rifle in her hands but not raised. 15 men emerged from the tree in thin as shadows, their clothes torn and faces hollowed by hunger. The one in front held his hands out, empty and open. They didn't speak her language. She didn't speak theirs, but hunger had. A universal grammar. She thought about Nolan's warnings, about every story she'd ever heard, about the locked doors and loaded guns that defined survival out here. Then she thought about the last time she'd gone a full day without eating, back when the winter had been cruel and supplies ran low. How the hunger made her hands shake. How it made the world feel smaller and sharper. She lowered the rifle. The men ate everything she put in front of them. Cornbread, dried meat, the last of the preserves she'd been saving. They ate in silence, their eyes never meeting hers, their hands careful and deliberate. When they finished, the leader stood and placed something on the table. A carved piece of wood, smooth and intricate, shaped like a bird in flight. Then they left, disappearing back into the trees, as quietly as they'd come. Will stood, alone, in her kitchen, the wooden bird in her palm, and felt the weight of something she couldn't name. She didn't sleep that night, and when the sun rose, the valley was full of warriors. The morning air tasted like dust and fear. Willa stood on her porch, the rifle at her side, her breath coming shallow and quick. The warriors hadn't moved. They sat on their horses in perfect stillness, a wall of bodies stretching across the valley floor from edge to edge. There had to be 300 of them, maybe more. She couldn't count them all. Without her eyes blurring, she forced herself to breathe slower. Panic wouldn't help, neither would the rifle. Not against those numbers. If they wanted her dead, she'd already be gone. But they were waiting for something. The sun climbed higher, burning off the thin fog that clung to the ground. Willa's legs act from standing, but she refused to sit. Sitting felt like surrender. She kept her eyes on the warriors, searching for movement, for intention, for any sign of what came next. Then one of them moved. A single rider broke from the formation, walking his horse slowly toward her cabin. Will's hand tightened on the rifle, but she didn't raise it. The rider stopped 30 feet from her porch. He was older than the men who'd come the night before, his face weathered and marked by scars that told stories she'd never hear. He wore no war paint. His hands were empty. He spoke, his voice low and steady, words she couldn't understand. Then he gestured behind him, toward the mass of warriors, and then to her. His expression was unreadable, but there was no aggression in his posture. He repeated the gesture. Her them, some connection she couldn't decipher. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She swallowed and tried again. I don't understand. The man nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that. He reached into a pouch at his side and pulled something out. He held it up where she could see it, another carved bird identical to the one the man had left on her table. He placed it carefully on the ground in front of him, then turned his horse and rode back to the formation without looking back. Willis stared at the wooden bird lying in the dirt. Two gifts. Now not threats, not demands, gifts. Behind her, she heard the distant sound of hoof beats coming fast. She turned and saw Nolan riding hard down the trail toward her cabin. Two other men with him. Their faces were tight with alarm. Nolan pulled his horse to a stop in a spray of dirt and dismounted before the animal had fully stilled. What in God's name did you do? His voice was sharp, louder than it needed to be. The other men stayed mounted, their hands on their rifles, their eyes locked on the warriors in the valley. I fed them. That's all. Nolan grabbed her arm, his grip harder than he probably meant it to be. You fed them, and now they've brought an army to your door. You need to come with us now before this turns into a bloodbath. Will pulled her arm free and stepped back. She looked at Nolan, at the fear carved into every line of his face, and then she looked past him to the valley. The warriors still hadn't moved, still waiting. I'm not leaving. Nolan's face went red. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to something that sounded more like pleading than anger. Willa, listen to me. Those men down there, they're not here to thank you. You don't bring 300 warriors to deliver gratitude. This is a show of force. They're making a point. She met his eyes and saw a genuine fear. They're the kind that made men do dangerous things. Behind him, one of the other men shifted in his saddle, his rifle now across his lap instead of on his back. What point would that be? Nolan threw his hands up. That you're under their protection now or their control. Same thing. Either way, you've put yourself in their debt, and they've come to collect. Willa shook her head. Slowly, she looked down at the carved bird still sitting in the dirt where the warrior had left it. If they wanted to collect, they'd be at my door. There, staying in the valley. One of the mounted men spoke up, his voice tight. For now. But what happens when more settlers see this? When word spreads that there's an army camped in our valley. This isn't just about you anymore. Willa, you've brought trouble to all of us. She turned to face him, and something cold settled in her chest. I didn't bring anyone. They came on their own. Nolan grabbed her shoulder. Gentler, this time, but still firm. Then send them away. Go down there and tell them to leave. Whatever debt you think you owe them, it's paid. Just make them go before someone does something stupid. Before he finished speaking, the sound of more horses came from the opposite direction. Willa turned and saw four riders approaching fast from the east, rifles visible against the morning sky. Settlers from the neighboring properties, drawn by whatever rumors had already started spreading. They pulled up hard when they saw the warriors in the valley, their horses snorting and stamping. One of them, a thick-shouldered man named Harlan, called out without dismounting. We came, as soon as we heard. How many are there? 300, Nolan said. Maybe more. Harlan's jaw tightened. His hand moved to the rifle on his saddle. Then we need to ride for help. Get the others. We can have 50 men here by nightfall. Willa felt the situation tilting, sliding, towards something that couldn't be. Stop once it started. She stepped forward, her voice louder than she intended. Nobody's riding for help, and nobody's starting a fight. Heron looked at her like she'd lost her mind. You think they're here to talk? Look at them, Willa. That's not a delegation. That's an invasion force. The warriors in the valley remained motionless, but Willa could feel the tension stretching tighter, like rope about to snap. One wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, and the whole thing would explode into violence that would stain this valley red for generations. She looked at Nolan, then at Harlan, then at all the men gathered around her cabin with their fear and their rifles and their certainty that blood was the only answer. Give me one day, just one. Let me figure out what they want. And if what they want is you dead, Nolan asked quietly, then you'll know by sunset. The men left reluctantly, promising to return by nightfall with more help. Whether Willow wanted it or not, she watched them right away, their backs stiff with anger and fear, and felt the weight of what she just committed to. One day, to understand what 300 warriors wanted from her, one day to prevent a massacre. She walked down from her porch toward the valley, each step deliberate and slow. The morning sun was climbing higher now, heating the air until it shimmered above the dirt. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust with every step. The warriors watched her approach, but made no move to meet her. Halfway, they simply waited, a wall of silent judgment. When she was 50 feet from the nearest rider, she stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought they might hear it. She raised one hand, palm out, the universal gesture of peace. Then she pointed to herself and spoke clearly. Willa. The warriors remained motionless. She tried again, slower this time, touching her chest. Willa. My name is Willa. Nothing. The silence stretched so long she wondered if they understood anything she was trying to communicate. Then the same older warrior from earlier nudged his horse forward a few steps. He touched his own chest. Nez. She exhaled a breath. She didn't know she'd been holding a name. That was something. That was a beginning. Nez gestured behind him too. The mass of warriors then made a sweeping motion with his arm that encompassed the entire valley. Then he pointed to her cabin and finally to her. The meaning felt just out of reach, like try to read words through water. She pointed to her cabin, then to herself. My home. Nez nodded, then repeated the same gesture. The valley, the warriors, her cabin, her. There was a connection. He was trying to show her, but the language barrier turned everything into shadows and guesswork. She took a chance. She pointed to the wooden bird she'd left on her porch, visible from where they stood. Then she made a gesture of thanks, placing her hand over her heart and bowing her head slightly. Nez watched her carefully. Then he called out something in his language, sharp and clear. Immediately, 4 warriors dismounted and walked to the back of the formation. They returned, carrying something large wrapped in animal hide. They approached slowly, stopping 10 feet from Willa and laying their burden on the ground before stepping back. She moved forward, cautiously, and pulled back the hide. Inside was food, dried meat, cornmeal, preserved fruits, more than she'd seen in months, enough to last her through the winter twice over. Her hands trembled as she touched it, trying to understand what this meant. Nez spoke, again gesturing to the food, then to her, then back to the warriors. She looked up at him, at the 300 men watching her every move, and suddenly the pieces began to shift into place. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't conquest or control. This was payment. They'd come to repay what she'd given, but the scale of it, the sheer number of warriors, suggested. This was about something far larger than 15 hungry men and a shared meal. Before she could process what that meant, she heard horses approaching fast from the west. Not Nolan this time. A larger group, armed and moving with purpose. The warriors heard it too. Their stillness shifted to readiness. Hands moving to weapons they'd kept sheathed. Until now, 20 settlers rode into view. Rifles across their saddles, faces set, hard with determination. Heron led them, with Nolan close behind, looking sick. With worry, they pulled up at the edge of Willa's property, forming a ragged line between her cabin and the valley, where the warriors waited. Harlan dismounted, his eyes never leaving the warriors. Were not waiting until sunset. Willa, this ends now one way or another. She moved quickly, positioning herself between the settlers and the warriors. Her arms spread wide. Nobody fires. Nobody moves. Do you understand? Me? One of the settlers, a young man she didn't recognize, called out. There, armed and on our land. That's all the understanding I need. Willa's voice came out harder than she'd ever heard it. Sound. This is my land, mine, and I'm telling you to stand down. But the damage was already done. The settlers' arrival had shifted something in the valley. The warriors were no longer still. They'd spread out slightly, creating better positions, their hands near their weapons. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning struck. Nez rode forward again, stopping between his warriors and the settlers. He looked at Willa, and she saw a question in his eyes, a choice being offered. She could walk away now, join the settlers, and whatever happened next wouldn't be her burden to carry. Instead, she walked toward Nez, away from the armed men. Behind her, Harlan's voice cracked like a whip. What are you doing? She kept walking until she stood beside Nez's horse in full view of both groups. Then, she turned to face the settlers, her back to the warriors. It was the most vulnerable position she could take, and everyone there understood what it meant. I'm asking you to trust me. These men aren't here for war. How do you know that? Nolan asked, and his voice was hollow with fear for her. Because they would have killed me already if that's what they wanted. They've had every chance. She gestured to the pile of food, still lying in the dirt. They brought supplies, food. They're repaying what I gave them. Harlan spat into the dust. 300 warriors don't show up to deliver groceries. Wake up, Willa. You're being used. Before she could respond, Nez spoke, not to her, but to his warriors. His voice carried across the valley, clear and commanding. Immediately, every warrior dismounted, 300 men stepping down from their horses in perfect unison, the sound like distant thunder. Then, moving as one, they all sat down. On the ground, weapons laid aside, hands visible and empty. The settlers shifted uneasily, their rifles no longer pointed but still held ready. The gesture was unmistakable. The warriors had made themselves vulnerable, defenseless, as a show of peaceful intent. Nez looked at Willa and spoke. Again, words she couldn't understand but whose meaning felt clear. He was trusting her to translate this moment, to make the settlers understand what he couldn't say in their language. She turned to Harlan, to Nolan, to all the men who'd come ready to fight. They're not here to take. They're here to honor a debt. The men I fed, they weren't just hungry. They were starving, dying, and I was the only one who helped them. Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through. In their culture, that means something. It means I'm owed protection, safety, and they came to give it. Harlan's grip on his rifle loosened slightly, but his jaw stayed tight. For how long? How long do they plan to camp? In our valley? How long until this protection turns into something else? Willow looked at Nez, at the warriors, sitting peacefully in the dirt, at the massive gesture of trust they just offered, and she realized she didn't have an answer to that question. The silence stretched so long that Willa felt it pressing against her ears. Then, one of the 15 men from the night before stepped forward from the seated warriors. He was young, maybe 20, and he walked toward the settlers with his hands raised and empty. When he reached Willa, he stopped and touched his chest. Hashk. Then he pointed to the other 14 men scattered among the warriors. He spoke in halting, broken English words that came slowly and with effort. My brothers, my father, my uncles, we were dying. 3 days, no food, no water. He gestured to the mountains behind them. We were hunting far from home. Storm came, lost everything. Horses ran. Food gone. His voice grew quieter. And Willis saw shame in his face. We walked 4 days. So hungry, so weak. Everyone we met, they chased us away, threw rocks, fired guns to scare us. He looked at Willa, and his eyes were bright with emotion he was trying to control. You didn't. You saw us as men, not enemies, just men who needed help. Harlan shifted his weight, uncomfortable but listening. Hashk continued, my father, he is chief of our people. When we came home, we told him what you did. He said, there is old law, very old. When someone saves your family from death, they become family too. Protected always. He gestured to the warriors sitting in the dirt. These men, they're all family. Cousins, brothers, sons. My father sent them to show you are not alone now. You are protected. Nolan spoke up, his voice careful. For how long? Hashk looked, confused by the question. He turned to Nez, spoke quickly in their language, then turned back. Always. This is not temporary. This is forever bond. The word forever landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through both groups. Forever protection meant forever presence. It meant these warriors would consider this valley their responsibility, which meant the settlers would have to share space with people they'd feared for years. Harlan's voice came out strained. We can't have 300 warriors camped in our valley forever. You understand that, right? This isn't sustainable. Willow watched Hash translate for Nez. Watched the older warrior's face as he listened. Nez responded and Hash turned back to them. We don't stay here. We go home, but we come back to check to make sure she is safe to bring supplies when winter is hard to help if there's trouble. He paused, then added something that wasn't quite a threat but felt like one. Anyway, and if someone hurts her, we come back to make it right. One of the younger settlers spoke up, voice tight. That sounds like you're claiming this land. No, Hash said firmly. We claim her. The land is still yours. But she is ours now too. This is our way. Willa felt the weight of what that meant, settling onto her shoulders. She hadn't just fed 15 hungry men. She created a bond that would reshape the relationship between settlers and the tribe for years to come. Every interaction, every conflict, every negotiation would now have to account for this connection. Nolan stepped closer to her, speaking low enough that only she could hear. Do you understand what you've done? You've made yourself the bridge between two worlds that don't want to touch. She looked at him, then at the warriors, sitting peacefully in the dust, then at the settlers with their rifles in fear. Maybe that's exactly what this valley needed. The sun had passed its peak and was beginning its slow descent toward the western hills. Willis sat on her porch, the food the warriors had brought, still piled near her door. The settlers had moved back to give space for talking, but they hadn't left. They stood in small clusters, rifles lowered, but not put away, watching and waiting to see how this would end. Nez and Hash sat on the ground in front of her porch, close enough to talk, but far enough to show respect. The other warriors remained in the valley, patient as stone. Hash spoke first, his broken English slow and careful. We need you to understand something. What my father offers is not a burden. It is honor in our tribe, to be chosen as protected. Family means you matter. It means your life has value that goes beyond blood. Willa picked at a loose thread on her dress, thinking about her husband, about the 3 years she'd spent alone on this land, about how small her world had become. I never asked for this. No one asked for family, it just happens. She looked up at him, saw the sincerity in his young face. And what happens if I say no? What if I tell you I don't want protection? Hash translated for Nez. The older warrior's response came swift and firm. Hash turned back to Willa. He says you can refuse the protection, but you cannot refuse the gratitude, the food, the supplies. Those are yours, no matter what. The debt is paid, but the bond that stays in our hearts, even if you reject it from yours. Nolan had been listening from a distance. He walked closer now, his expression troubled. This changes everything. And you know that if word spreads that you're under tribal protection, every settler in the territory is going to have an opinion about it. Some will call you a traitor. Others will want to use you as a negotiator. You'll never have peace. Again, Will stood up slowly, feeling the ache in her knees, the weight of her years. She looked at Nolan, at the good man who tried so hard to protect her, even when she didn't want protecting. I haven't had peace since my husband died. Maybe I've been alone too long. Maybe this is God's strange way of giving me a family again. She turned to face all the settlers who'd gathered. I know this scares you. It scares me too. But I'm tired of fear being the only thing that decides how we live. These men could have taken everything from me. Instead, they brought gifts. They sat down, unarmed. They offer me something I haven't had in years. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. They offered me respect. Harlan spoke up, but his voice had lost its sharp edge. And what do you want from us? I want you to give them a chance. Not trust, not friendship, just a chance. Let them leave today knowing that the next time they come to check on me, they won't be met with rifles and fear. The settlers exchanged looks, uncomfortable with what she was asking, but unable to argue with the simple truth of her words. One by one, they began to lower their weapons, not putting them away, but pointing them at the ground instead of at the warriors. It was the smallest gesture, barely more than nothing, but Hashk saw it, and he translated for Nez. The old warrior's face softened slightly, and he nodded once. Then he stood and spoke to his warriors. As one, they rose from the ground, gathered their horses, and began to prepare to leave. Before they mounted, Nez approached Willow one last time. He reached into his pouch and pulled out one more carved bird, pressing it into her palm. Then he spoke, and Hash translated, 3 birds, 1 for the meal you gave, 1 for the lives you saved, 1 for the bridge you built. Will closed her fingers around the wooden bird and felt tears she'd been holding back finally break free. Winter came early that year, hard and unforgiving. Snow buried the valley 3 feet deep, and the wind cut through walls like they were made of paper. Willa stood on her porch wrapped in a thick blanket, watching smoke rise from the cabins scattered across the white landscape. 6 months had passed since the day 300 warriors filled her valley. She wasn't alone anymore. Nolan rode up her path, his horse struggling through the drifts. He dismounted and stomped the snow from his boots before climbing onto the porch. He carried a bundle wrapped in cloth from a cooper's. They wanted you to have it. She unwrapped it to find fresh bread, still warm. The Coopers lived 4 miles south, and they'd made the trip in this weather just to bring her food. 3 months ago, they wouldn't have spoken to her at all, called her a traitor behind her back, avoided her at every gathering. That changed when the warriors came back. It had been early autumn, just as the Settlers were preparing for the harsh season ahead. A group of raiders had swept down from the north, desperate men, willing to take what they needed by force. They'd hit 2 ranches before. Anyone knew they were coming, stealing livestock and supplies, burning what they couldn't carry. Then they'd made the mistake of targeting Willis' neighbors. Hashk and 30 warriors had appeared within hours, seemingly out of nowhere. They'd tracked the raiders, recovered the stolen goods, and escorted the criminals to the nearest settlement. With a law officer. No violence, no bloodshed, just swift, decisive action that protected everyone in the valley. After that, the settlers stopped seeing the warriors as a threat. They started seeing them as neighbors. Nolan settled into the chair beside Willa, looking out at the White Valley. You know what Martha said to me yesterday? She said she's teaching her daughter to carve wood. Wants to make one of those birds, like the ones Nez gave you. Said it'd be nice to have something to remember this winter by. Willa smiled, touching the 3 wooden birds that hung from a string over her door. They moved slightly in the cold breeze, casting small shadows on the snow. Things change, she said quietly. Sometimes for the better. Hash visits twice a month. Now, brings supplies, checks on you, talks with the settlers. Half of them actually look forward to seeing him. The young Cooper boy asked to learn their language. Willa nodded. She'd noticed the fear that had defined the valley for so long was slowly being replaced by something that looked almost like trust. It was fragile, delicate, could shatter with one wrong move, but it was there. You were right, Nolan said, his voice carrying something that might have been respect or might have been apology about giving them a chance about being the bridge. She didn't respond, just watched the snowfall in the growing darkness. Her life hadn't gotten easier. People still came to her with their problems, asked her to mediate disputes, wanted her to speak on their behalf. When the warriors visited, she'd become exactly what Nolan predicted. The bridge between 2 worlds that didn't want to touch. But she wasn't alone anymore. And in a place as hard and unforgiving as this valley, that meant everything. Inside her cabin, 3 wooden birds hung above her table. 1 for a meal shared, 1 for lives saved, 1 for the bridge she'd built with nothing more than compassion and a refusal to let fear make her decisions. The wind howled through the valley, cold and fierce, but Willie Glen stood warm on her porch, protected by an alliance born from a single act of kindness. She had fed 15 starving men, and in return, they had given her a family that stretched beyond blood, beyond culture, beyond the divisions that had once seemed impossible to cross. The valley had changed, and so had she. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and unexpected choices reshape destinies in ways no one saw coming. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.